The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Causality and God. Hey, how you doing? I hope you're doing well. I'm going to be posting this video because I've talked about causation from the standpoint of detecting supernatural causation in the past. And there's a video up explaining not only why I don't think that we have the ability to demonstrate supernatural causation, but why we may in fact be barred from actually ever being able to demonstrate supernatural causation. There's a lot of problems with it. In a recent debate that I did with Dr. Kenny Rhodes at Modern Day Debates, we were talking, or we were supposed to be talking, about whether or not there's good evidence to believe that a God exists. I've already posted the debate and I've done a debate review. We're not going to be going back through this discussion about essence and composition and all of these things. But there was a moment during the Q&A that before he answered was my favorite moment from the debate. In these discussions, I'm genuinely trying to find the best understanding of my opponent's position. There was a moment during the debate where he was asked a question and he really couldn't give an answer. And so I steel-manned his answer for him. And he acknowledged that it was a good answer, even though he had previously told me that I didn't understand the subject. So I was the only one of the two of us who could answer on his behalf, which is not particularly fun. I mean, for jokes, sometimes I may put on my Jesus hat or my Christian hat and do my best to represent the other side, but it's not always easy. In this case, I'm going to play the clip in a moment. A questioner had basically asked why Kenny opted for the Abrahamic God instead of the God of the Zoroastrians or something similar, given that those were earlier and the evidence or the type of argument that he was making didn't really tie itself exclusively to the Abrahamic God. It was just kind of a generic deistic, there must be something that is combining these things to make things. But it gave us the opportunity, because Kenny's answer, as you'll hear in the first part, there'll be part of his clip. This begins at roughly 1 hour, 48 minutes and 30 seconds. Kenny will talk about why he reached this conclusion, and some of it has to do with a revelation from God. And this prompts a question from me, which you'll hear, about how do we tell whether or not there is a revelation from God. And then we'll get to Kenny's answer. I've done my best to transcribe Kenny's answer. It will appear over here off to the side. I've removed any uhs and ums. The purpose of this is not to beat Kenny up. It is not to make him look bad. It is to point out that there was an opportunity here to present a case for how we demonstrate causation and how one could actually demonstrate that a God had in fact revealed itself. And that opportunity was missed. I'm going to go through his answer. I'm going to try to be as charitable as possible and do my best to steelman as much of the answer as I can. But what we'll see is that this was a missed opportunity, and it may be missed for a very good reason. And so here is the clip.
I'd actually start with the self-evident nature of my own existence, trace that back to God, and then ask questions and see if God has revealed himself.
Gotcha. And thank you very much for this.
How do you tell, by the way? Like, if you ask questions to see if God revealed himself, I swear, I promise you, Kenny, I swear, this isn't some trick or anything else. I've been asking the same question for ages, even back when I was a believer. People say, oh, I asked God to reveal himself. How do you know when that's happened?
I think for just looking at outside evidence, I would just see where there would be evidence for this God to break into space and time. I do believe that miracles or the historical report of those miracles, I hold that the biblical documents are good historical biblical documents before I attribute to them inspiration or the fact that they've come from God. But I look at them as historic documents and then simply go from there, see if there's good evidence for the fact that predictive prophecy came true. I would ask questions of origin, meaning, morality, destiny, seeing if this revelation had explanatory scope and power. There would be those types of questions.
I'll go ahead and pause there. That was the end of Kenny's answer. We went on to other questions in the Q&A. Looking at what he said, and again, this is a live debate, and it's during the Q&A, and it's not an easy thing to do, to be able to speak off the cuff and to answer questions that you may not have prepared for. But this is the sort of question that, if you think that God's revealed himself to you, and you think that you have a good, sound epistemology, a way to demonstrate that this is the case, it's something that should have come up before. That doesn't mean that somebody's necessarily going to be able to explain it well. But if we look at what he says, he begins with, I think for just looking at outside evidence, I would just see whether there would be evidence for this God to break into space and time. Yes, that is essentially what we're asking. God, who he thinks exists outside of space and time, is supposedly revealing himself to people within space and time. And so you would look for evidence for this God to break into space and time. But what we're asking is, what is that evidence and how can you tell? The next sentence, or the next portion of his answer, where he says, I believe that miracles are the historical report of those miracles. I hold that the biblical documents are good historical biblical documents before I attribute to them inspiration or the fact that they've come from God. But I look at them as historical documents and then simply go from there, see if there's good evidence for the fact that predictive prophecy came true. Yes, that sentence is a mess. It's disjointed. If you tried to diagram it, it'd be a mess. But if we're being as charitable as possible, what he's saying is that he accepts that the biblical accounts are reliable. And yes, I understand that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with how we demonstrate that God has revealed himself. I'll get to the fact that he's assuming quite a bit. But he accepts the biblical documents, that they're reliable, and then he looks at them and sees if there's evidence of predictive prophecy. The problem is that setting aside, I don't know how you demonstrate that there is predictive prophecy. That's a secondary question. But the other one is, why on earth is predictive prophecy a key factor in whether or not something was revealed by God? It's an assumption, I guess. And then he continues by saying, I would ask questions of origin, meaning, morality, destiny, seeing if, this revelation had explanatory scope and power. There would be those types of questions. When we're talking about causation, we're talking about whether or not agent or phenomenon X causes the effect Y. Causality is difficult to understand, explain under the best of circumstances. It often requires intuitive leaps. It often is predicated on this notion that we're talking about demonstrating a strong correlation. Imagine if I had a stack of Jenga blocks here and we were playing a game and the tower falls over. We would then ask the question, what caused the tower to fall over? And there are a number of potential explanations that we could reach. It could be that whoever was moving it pulled too hard, set things off balance, and then, the laws of physics took over and gravity causes it to tumble. And so on that grounds, we could just say that every time that a Jenga tower falls over, the cause is gravity. But that's not really what we're asking, because if we had left the tower alone and done nothing, would it have fallen over? Or was it because a person was manipulating it? Or perhaps, maybe there was an earthquake. Maybe there was some external cause as well. And so if you were sitting around playing a game of Jenga and you were looking at the blocks and you went in to reach and maybe you just barely touched it, not enough to move it, or weren't sure if you touched it and the whole tower fell over, you can imagine sitting there and having somebody go, I didn't do that. I did not do that. There must have been there's a wind that came through here and blew. There was an earthquake. I didn't touch it. There's no way that I touched it enough to knock it over. This is the sort of thing that we do. But if somebody said it was a ghost that knocked over that Jenga tower, what would we think of that? And how would we demonstrate that it was in fact a ghost? Because before you could claim that a ghost knocked it over, you'd need good evidence or at least some acceptance among the parties involved that ghosts exist and ghosts exist and can actually intervene in reality in some way where they could potentially knock the blocks over, because it's possible for ghosts to exist and yet they can't mess with the corporal world at all. My hand is one of the possible explanations for how the tower fell over, but we list candidate explanations based on what we already know. Now, it is possible to propose a hypothetical cause and show that these effects strongly correlate with this hypothetical cause, but that would require us to spend some time defining that cause and demonstrating that there's some likelihood or possibility that this cause exists. This is why I've done a video and talked about before the problem of demonstrating supernatural causation. I don't think it's possible currently, and it may be impossible forever. The answers and explanations that people try to give about causality are messy. And it's not surprising to me that in the middle of a debate that Kenny was asked a question and didn't really give an answer that we can glean much information from at all. At best, he's saying, I would look at the evidence, find the evidence that exists that is consistent with God, and show a correlation, which I suppose is as good of an answer as you're likely to get. But when you look at the proposed categories or questions that he would ask, he's like, those would be the types of questions. The thing is, it's not the questions that are the method. Questions are how we go about getting the information. It is the answers to those questions that we use. If you want to find out if smoking caused cancer, or if vaccines caused autism, or if I knocked over the Jenga tower, yes, you would ask questions. And you would ask questions that were related to me, the Jenga tower, physics, the discussions, all these things. But it's not the questions that are the method to determine whether or not I knocked over the Jenga tower. And when we look at what Kenny has to say, this note that I added before about predictive prophecy, there's an assumption there that predictive prophecy is a characteristic that we could attribute to a god. Also, when he says he would ask questions of origin, well, that's pretty vague. Meaning, I'm not completely sure what type of what that even means. What is the meaning of meaning in this context? And why is meaning a litmus test for God? Morality, same question. Destiny, those are the origin, meaning, morality, destiny. But all of those presume that there's something about those categories that necessarily demonstrate a God revealing himself. And the only reason that Kenny thinks those are evidence of a God revealing himself is that he's already accepted a God concept that has those qualities. But if we're talking about how to tell whether or not a God has revealed itself, and you don't have an actual God to point to, then those are the things that would be revealed. Has my mom revealed herself? Well, how would I do that? I would look for things that are consistent with the nature of my mom. Did my mom write this note? I would look for things that are consistent with my mom. But I know my mom. I know how my mom writes. You can't do the same thing. And since Kenny, in this case, is pointing to the Bible, that wasn't the actual question. The actual question that I asked was, how can you tell in any way, at any time, that any God has ever revealed itself? He went essentially to the Bible. And when you do that, you're assuming the very thing that you're trying to demonstrate. Essentially, he begins with what the Bible describes as God, accepts that this is an accurate model of God, and then looks around at the world to see what is consistent with that. That is not a methodology for discovering the truth. It is not a methodology for demonstrating that a God exists, or that a God has revealed itself, or that a God has demonstrated its existence in any way. It's a methodology for self-deception. It is a methodology for, I'm going to believe this, and then when I go out and look around the world, I'm going to take all the things that seem consistent with this, put them together in a package, and say, here is the evidence for what I believe, while ignoring the other things. It would be like if the Jenga tower fell over and I had been touching it, but we decided to spend our time looking for evidence of an earthquake. Well, as it turns out, there are earthquakes all over the world, almost all the time. And maybe the Jenga tower was just so fragile that the earthquake that happened 4 hours earlier in another part of the world sent a teeny, teeny, teeny little shockwave over that somehow overcomes the tower. When we're talking about causation, the types of terminology that we use for this, we talk about necessary causes, we talk about sufficient causes, and we talk about proximal causes. And proximal, not only with regard to physical proximity, but temporal proximity as well. Causation, causality, the study of it, the confirmation of it is a big deal, and it is not always easy. So I'm not going to beat Kenny up for not having a good answer to this in a live debate. So the question then becomes, what actually is the methodology? Set aside the debate, take some time, put it together, describe as best you can what methodology was actually used to determine whether or not a God revealed itself. I've been asking for years. I have yet to see anything that approaches a reliable methodology. And in many cases, I'm not even sure we have anything that qualifies as an answer. We'll see you next time.